coming from the UK, you know, fishing wet flies, soft hackles and spiders. It's kind of like a way of life, you know, and back, what, now, and 60 years ago, that's really what my roots were, and still are, largely, to some extent. And so, you know, I have great fondness to producing those kind of flies. There's a thing about, you know, the balance and the symmetry of those kind of flies in. For Europeans, the definition of a wet fly is a fly that essentially is of a traditional nature, i.e. it's got a tail, hackle, body and wings. So that's the traditional wet fly. Then you have the North Country style flies, which orientate to the northern part of England, which would come under the banner of what you call soft hackles and or spiders. And spiders essentially are really sparse flies with typically thread bodies and just a wound hackle. That's pretty much it. When I first came out, I could never understand why the American fly fishermen say, oh, we're fishing wet flies and we're fishing a nymph. Well, to me, there's a classification of flies. So, you know, a nymph is a nymph, which is some representation of immature stages of an insect's life, no matter whether it's a caddis or a mayfly. Streamers, in the UK they tend to call them lures, but we know what they are. Dry flies, obviously flies that represent something that's on or near the surface, invertebrate, fly life and or terrestrial, and wet flies. So if you said to me wet flies, I would assume you were talking about traditionally wing wet flies, and possibly in the case of soft hackles and spiders. Okay, so that's how I see the categorization. So a wet fly is not by just definition a fly that is sunk and or fished below the surface, which of course it is a wet fly, but it's not categorized as either a nymph, a spider, a soft hackle or a winged traditional wet fly. Okay, I do know, because I've taught fly tying classes all over the world, that tying wings on traditional wet flies is problematical for individuals. So I'm going to show you something little ways around that to some extent, where you're going to create a wing on the fly, but you're not going to have to worry about marrying or putting together a matched pair of wing slips to form that wing. I'm generally going to use hooks of size 12, 14, sometimes 16, sometimes 18s, particularly for some of those smaller spider patterns there I showed you in the fly box. And you know, when you're tying flies that incorporate a lot of different materials, then you have to be a little more precise about position of the material and how you use your thread. And no question of a doubt about it, I look at a lot of flies that people have tied, and a number of things stick out to me straight away. And one of those is that they use excessive amounts of thread. Once again, I never start the thread directly behind the eye of the hook, because I don't want to build unnecessary bulk at that particular point. I'm going to start the thread somewhere around about 2-3 millimeters back from the eye. Now we're going to put a trailing shuck on this fly. We're going to use a few strands of a material called Zlon, which is really kind of like a translucent fiber, and you get those in different colors too. Pretty much here we're just going to use a neutral color, and we're going to just set that across on top of the shank of the hook. If I'm going to use my thumb and my first finger, see how much that crowds that out. You can't really see what you're doing, whereas if I use these two fingers, I can see easily. I know my nails are a little long, but it doesn't matter because I tend to use my nail for a lot of techniques anyway. So we're going to set that down on the top of the hook, and if you keep the material held uppermost and you continue with your thread wraps rearward, then you will always maintain it to stay above the shank of the hook, and we get to that point there. Okay, and we can just cut that away. So we've got that part done. We're just going to attach in a ribbon medium, which could be gold, silver or different colored wires. That's up to you. If you hold this here and you do this, Alright, I know how to do it, so I get it right every time. But I will tell you, if you're going to catch a material in underneath, don't hold it this way. Hold it underneath, directly square to the shank of the hook, and just take a soft wrap of thread over. Or, alternatively, you hold that material, you hold it left side of your thread, you touch it against the thread, see that? Just lift it right back over the top and pull it back. And as long as you keep that within the distance of the body of the fly, you don't have no surplus to cut off. Okay, so we made no turns of thread to actually put that into position. We're going to form a dub body. Largely techniques of dubbing is pretty much based on a selection of material, and secondly what you do as far as manipulation with your fingers is concerned. The most important thing is that you extrude the material out. What I mean by that is you don't just pick a lump out and you add it to the hook thread like that. You get it and you tease it. See that? So I'm pulling it out, and that does a couple of things. First and foremost, I separate the fibers. That's important. But secondly, I can also see where there's any lumps of material in there and I need to remove them, if that being the case. Then we very, very gently, we just, what I would say, touch dub it around the thread base. You're not really compressing it, you're just making sure you have got a fairly even distribution. Okay, you've got that. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to pinch this tip end like that. Now I'll tell you another little tip. Oftentimes when you do this, you're going to have bare thread from the end of the dubbing to the shank of the hook, because it's nearly impossible to actually get the material close up to the shank of the hook. And don't start to wind here initially, because what you'll do, you'll build up a lot of unnecessary thread base. So if you carefully look at the distance between the hook shank and the beginning of your dubbing, just come back slightly till you start to initially see it to catch, then reverse back. So from the get-go, we're now catching our dubbing material. But what we're going to do is we're going to just catch this material here and twist it. See that? Okay, so we then come forward, and what you're doing as you wind in the dub body is that you're always looking at the conformation of shape you're developing. And so by seeing the distance between there and the hook shank, I know how many wraps of thread it's going to take before I get there to the termination of the body, which of course I did right there in one go. What we're going to do is going to take, in this case, a ribbon material. We're going to balance the bobbin on the finger. That allows us to work at a greater distance and with ease to bring up in nice, even, equidistant spacings a ribbon medium. When we get to the thread, don't do what most people do. They pick this up and they start throwing it back over there. You don't have to do that. All you've got to do is when you've terminated with the last turn of your ribbon, bring it up, transfer it over the top of the thread, back underneath, and as you come up with the thread, you lock it. And you let it go. Once you've made that one turn, you can let it go. And then two more to add your final security, and you essentially got that done. On a normal traditional wet fly, you'd come right forward to the eye, you would wind a hackle, and then you would set the winging. And we're going to do this slightly different. Remember that I said to you a little earlier on that for most people tying what we call paired wing slips, it's difficult. But the alternative is to use these, which are little CDC puffs. What I want you to do is just grasp the tip of that feather like that in your hackle pliers, and then just gently roll those fibers, stroke them together like that. See that? So basically what you're doing, you're compressing them together. And when you did that, just remove your hackle pliers, make sure you keep those like that, transfer that over, Then hold those above the shank of your hook, about roughly the length of the body to the tail. Make sure you keep them on the top. That's the most important thing. Alright, so let me show you again. See, you've got that little tag, and just where the material starts, at the end of that little tag, that's where you catch the thread. And make sure you've got them set central. Don't worry about the fact that they fluff up, because when they're wet in the water they're not going to do that. Alright, and you've got that nice and tight. Anything that you add to a fly that in some way has got some representation of mobility of movement, or representative, something they see in natural, is always worth. One of those is actually the use of legs that are formed from rooster centertail. You can go back to publications over 100 years ago, and knotted pheasant tail legs were used, and they were used primarily for crane flies. You can either form knotted legs from a singular feather, or you can create knotted legs with two strands of feather. The process is the same. You just kind of cut one margin by doing two at a time. So it takes a little bit of manipulation, and people do it different ways, but in my opinion the way I do it is the way I like to do it, and that's the end of it. So you get the two strands of pheasant tail, and then what you do is you turn them around like that. And essentially what you do is let me get it right, you form a little circle, you turn them around like that, and you catch them in your hand, so you've got a loop and the two fibers of tail. Long nose tweezers, put those through, grab those two strands and pull them back like that. And then as you tension them up, you rotate that crossover toward the tips of the feather, and so you end up with two little strands like that. You've got two choices to do it. I'll show you an easy way to do it, and a lot of people do it like this, and that's okay too if you want to do it that way. Is that they hold it to the side like that, and they tie the first one in, and then they tie the second one in. But I'll show you a real quick, neat way to do this. First and foremost, you pair up the two legs together, and ideally you create two legs that are basically identical. In other words, what I mean by that is from the knot point to the termination of the end of the fiber. Okay, obviously from experience I know exactly what position to do it, but essentially from the tying in point there, you want the legs to flay back, roughly speaking, about the end of the tail. So if you kind of envisage that distance, which is roughly about that, okay, so what we then do is we bring those forward like this, and we catch those in, and I'm showing you this as an example, and then we separate them, and if we bring that one back to the rear, see where the leg now is positioned, okay, and bring the other to the right like that, catch a thread on that, then essentially you set the legs where you want them to be, to the side of the fly body. Okay, so if you want longer legs, let them extend further out. Alright, bind them down to start with, about 3 wraps of thread, and then take one pair to the left, and then one pair to the right, and then you've got them left side and right side. See that? You have a number of different choices for hackle, and personally I like to use hen pheasant hackle for lots of reasons. Not for every fly, but for a lot of them I do. I just like the variables in the colours of these flies, and the conformation of the hackle is pretty nice too. It's got that natural curvature to it, and it blends itself well as a wound hackle. And if you don't have those, these soft hackle hen patches, they're really good too. You can get those in an enormous range of different colours to suit what you want. You can get them plain dyed colour, or you get like these what we call more variegated, where you got these black specks on them. Either way, it's up to you. But in every case, the preparation is the same. A lot of people have issues, as far as determining correct size of hackle. Well, there's no right and there's no wrong in that sense of the word. it's really just a question of the proportionate value based on the hook size you're using and the fly in question. But there is a way that you can assess that, and it's really this. If you draw those fibers out at a right angle to the stem, like this, okay, and you hold that stem at the position where you're going to tie it in, see how far those barbs extend to the bend of the hook. You know, are they like a little too short, or are they way out there, or whatever? You know, somewhere in the ballpark of about from the initial tying in point to just to the bend of the hook and a little more, proportionately, that would be okay. But what I do is this: I just very gently pull those fibers back. I don't rip them off, and there's a reason for that. A couple of reasons. In a lot of cases, if you jerk this too hard, you'll bust that feather right there, because that's the weakest point of the hackle right there. Secondly, if you keep these on, it also gives you something to hold on to when you wind the hackle. Hackle winding, there's a skill in this, and it takes practice. Probably the most common fault people make is they cause the hackle to twist during the process of the wind, and it gets ugly. It's not nice conformation. So the way to go about it is to grasp the hackle by the tip and draw those fibers back like that. That tells you two things. The primary one is that you've got separation of the fibers, but also you've got no bad disruption. In other words, you've got nice fibers, left side and right side of the quill, in the case of this. And what I do is this: as I draw the fibers back, I maintain my grip. I don't let it go. If you're going to use hackle pliers, that's up to you. The same principle applies. Get your hackle pliers, grip the tip of the hackle like this, and stroke those fibers back. Okay? And don't let them go. That's the thing. And then what we're then going to do is this. The only relative distance that we can tie in that piece of fiber is from there to there. And there's no purpose to tie it all in when it extends over the eye of the hook and you've got to cut it off afterwards anyway. You may as well do away with it before you start. And so by creating that little V, which is what that is, that little V is absolutely the most perfect place to initially catch it in, like that. See that? Now as you wind the thread forward, then you'll trap those ends of that hackle, and you don't have nothing to mess around with to try and cut out the way once you've wound it. So I've made one turn, then I'm going to make a second, and I'm going to make a third. And I know from experience that generally 3 turns is enough to secure it, assuming you don't jerk on it or pull it too hard during the process of your wind. Okay? So what we're going to do is this. I'm going to hold the hackle up. Okay? Remember, by keeping this here, you've got something more stable to hang on to. If you have to use hackle pliers, that's fine. Obviously I do when I'm using really tiny hackle, but out of choice I prefer not. So what we're going to do, we're going to hold the hackle up like this, so the face of the hackle faces me. Then I'm very gently going to draw those fibers rearward. Now very carefully watch. There are no fibers extending to the right side of the quill. Okay? Now, what's important, I take the hackle round underneath and I use my finger to stop it. It can't unwind. I bring the hackle back up, then I can loose it go. I do the same thing again. I draw the fibers rearward, I take the hackle round, I stop it, I bring it back up, and we do the same thing again. Obviously the fullness of the hackle is determined by the number of winds that you wish to make, and I'm probably making a little more than necessary here just to prove something to you. And we're just going to come back round again. Now, how do you secure the hackle? Well, the last thing you want to do is let go of it, because you release the tension. And I'll show you the easy way to do it. Is you hold the hackle up like this, the stem, and you bring the thread up like that, slightly over, and then very gently just pull that back under just gentle tension, and it'll keep it trapped. And as long as you keep tension on that thread, You see that? It ain't go nowhere. 1, 2, 3. Okay, and then we cut off the excess. Now, if you had paid attention, you will notice that I never used no thread wraps at all to force the inclination rearward of those fibers, because I processed that in the manner in which I wound it. I kept 100% control on that hackle as I did it. And it's not so easy to do that with hackle pliers, because as you wind hackle pliers, you actually create a twist as you're doing it. You know, people would do this kind of stuff years ago when they dry fly. They put the finger in here and revolve the hackle around. I'm telling you now, in a lot of cases you cannot do that with small hackle. There's no way. You'll bust them off, and hackle pliers like this for small delicate feathers are about worthless in the first place anyway. If you're going to use them, you want to get these small style English hackle pliers for working with small delicate hackle. A lot of hackle pliers out there serve no purpose for delicate fly patterns like this. Okay, so we're satisfied about that. We've got everything there except one small additional factor. We're going to make a little minute head on the fly. So I made 3 wraps of hackle. I've got a really beautiful, what I call circumference of surround of the hackle in a nice rearward inclination. If I'd have wanted to wind it more square like that, I would demonstrate the wind a little different, but that's not what we wanted. And all we're going to do is we're going to take a little piece of dubbing, and it doesn't really matter too much what it is. Alright, we're going to make a little small finish head to the fly. This is kind of just a little dark olive. Okay, we're just going to attach that to our thread, a small amount, and pinch this real tight, because we really want just next to nothing on that thread base. And slide it up, okay, and then just form a nice small real neat head there to the fly, and bring the thread forward when you've terminated the body. Now I know a lot of people carry on around winding thread. Why? You essentially finished winding the head of the fly. It's secure. You're going to add the further security with your whip finish, and there ain't no need to carry on wrapping threads. And I'll show you another neat way, if you don't already know it, how to finish off varnish on the head, which is not to do it once you finish the fly. It's to do it before, because it's much neater. All you're going to do is just get your varnish, tap it on the thread, a small amount. If you put too much on there, just nick the thread. See that? Kicks it off. But you've got sufficient on there. Bring it back down and make 1, 2, 3, 4 wraps of thread of your whip finish to secure it. I always do this too. To tighten it up, I get the back of my scissors, I put it against the eye of the hook, and I just cinch it in like that, and then you're done. So there you go. Not much to that, right? Okay.
So just finish that up.
If you really want to learn a lot more about the skills of traditional wet fly fishing, so to speak, whether it's upstream, across and downstream, well, you might want to get the Wet Fly Way DVD that I did some years ago, which covers a lot of those techniques, one way or the other, and or you can book yourself a trip and learn it that way. Obviously, you know, I need the right kind of water out there, and you go through the Dallas Fly Shop to do that.